He was thrown out before he even reached the door, his skin color judged louder than any word he might have spoken, pinned to the pavement by hands that had already decided he didn't belong. No questions, no hesitation, just the silent certainty of assumption cloaked in authority. A man, sharply dressed, with a calm gait and purpose in his step, dragged like a trespasser across concrete he technically owned. They didn't know his name. They didn't care. In their eyes, he wasn't a partner, an investor, or a visionary. He was just another black man in the wrong place, at the wrong time, with the wrong face. But this was not just a story about cruelty. It was about what happens when the assumptions fail, when the truth refuses to be ignored, when silence becomes strategy and dignity refuses to be erased. What they did to him in those first seconds would unravel everything they thought they controlled. Watch closely. Every detail matters. And if this moment gripped you, like and subscribe to follow the full journey. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you felt when the first twist hit. This is only the beginning. The morning began like any other in the financial district, brisk, mechanical, unfeeling. The sun hadn't yet burned the dew from the sidewalk, and the streets hummed with the movements of men and women who walked fast, talked fast, and never looked twice at anyone not dressed to match the marble and chrome of the buildings towering above. The Wacth Financial Tower, 39 stories of glass and steel, gleamed in the rising light like a blade angled toward the sky. At the edge of its steps stood a man who didn't match the tempo or texture of the world around him. His name was Simeon Varelli. He stood still, arms at his side, eyes fixed on the peak of the tower as if trying to remember the shape of something long buried. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't performing urgency. And that alone marked him as suspicious in a city that trusted speed more than silence. His clothes were modest. A tan coat that looked too warm for the weather, gray slacks slightly bagged at the knee, brown shoes clean but aged. He carried a leather folder beneath one arm, worn at the corners and marked by years of handling. The guards in the lobby of the Wacth watched him through the glass. One of them, Branton, leaned on the front desk with a half-eaten breakfast burrito in his hand, smirking like he already had the joke in mind. His partner, Kellis, thinner, sharper, with that look in his eyes that always searched for something to correct, was already shaking his head. No one had spoken to Simeon. No one had checked a log or asked for his name. It didn't matter. They had already decided he didn't belong. Branton shoved the rest of his burrito into the trash, wiped his mouth on the back of his hand, and nodded to Kellis, who straightened his belt and followed. The glass doors hissed open, releasing a burst of cool air that hit the heat of the morning like a slap. Simeon didn't move when they approached. He simply lowered his gaze from the top of the building to the faces that now stood before him with postures soaked in contempt. Branton stepped close, arms crossed, chin lifted, mouth curved into a smirk meant to provoke. Kellis hung back slightly, glancing at the folder tucked beneath Simeon's arm as if it were hiding something dangerous. They asked him what he was doing there. They asked him why he hadn't gone inside. They asked him if he was lost. They didn't wait for full answers. They interrupted him, cut him off. When he said he had an appointment, they asked for proof. He pulled out a folded sheet of paper, an official-looking schedule bearing the letterhead of Wexley and Mordale, a law firm occupying the 25th floor. Branton didn't even read it. He took it, held it up to the sunlight, laughed, then handed it back without meeting Simeon's eyes. Kellis asked to see what was in his folder. Simeon hesitated, not from fear, but from a long-familiar sense of violation. He opened it anyway, revealing neatly clipped pages, site plans, property deeds, architectural renderings drawn in clean graphite strokes. Kellis flipped through them with 2 fingers, nodding at Branton as if to say, just as I thought. They told him he couldn't stay there. They said loitering wasn't allowed. Simeon explained again. He had a meeting, a legitimate one, scheduled and confirmed. He pointed to his name printed next to the appointment time. But Branton had already stepped closer, crowding his space, lifting his radio as if preparing to call someone. Simeon kept his voice even. He offered identification, a valid state ID, clean and current. Kellis looked at it, scoffed, and made a comment about how easy it was to get fakes these days. Simeon blinked, said nothing, just folded the ID and tucked it away again. A moment later, Branton reached for the folder and yanked it from under Simeon's arm. Pages scattered onto the steps, several drifting down toward the street. Kellis barked at Simeon to retrieve them. When he knelt to pick them up, Branton nudged the back of his coat with a boot, almost casually, like one might do to a stray animal. People passed by. A few slowed. None stopped. One woman with a designer bag stepped wide to avoid the papers and shook her head as if Simeon were nothing more than a nuisance. A man in a suit looked at him, frowned, and turned away. Another security guard inside the lobby watched through the glass, hands behind his back, offering no reaction. Once the pages were gathered, creased, wet at the edges, and dirty, Simeon stood again. He held them close to his chest like something fragile. Branton told him one last time to leave. He nodded toward the crosswalk, said if Simeon really had business there, he could wait on the other side of the street until someone came to get him. Simeon looked at him, not with anger, not with fear, but with the kind of quiet that made Branton's smile falter for half a second. Then he turned and walked away. Across the street, he found a bench with peeling paint and sat down. He looked back at the building, at the flags, the windows, the glint of sunlight bouncing off the upper floors, and thought of his father, who once walked the same sidewalks with blue ink on his fingers and dreams in his chest. The folder sat on his lap now, the documents inside reshuffled but intact. He straightened one corner, folded another. His hand trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something deeper. The meeting was not optional. He wasn't just a man with blueprints and an appointment. He was a man with ownership interests, legal documents, and leverage. But none of that seemed to matter earlier, not when faced with the unspoken rules enforced by men who saw only what they wanted to see. He gathered himself slowly, stood up, brushed the creases from his slacks, and crossed the street again. This time, he entered the building without pausing on the steps. His presence seemed to ripple across the lobby as he stepped inside, the polished marble floor amplifying the sound of his shoes, still clean but slightly damp from the earlier encounter. The guard stiffened as he approached. Branton pushed off the desk and moved to intercept him, his expression immediately souring. Kellis wasn't far behind, stepping up with a look that was more annoyed than surprised. Simeon stopped just before the security desk and calmly presented his appointment confirmation again, holding the folded sheet between two fingers. He spoke clearly, respectfully, noting the exact time and the individual he was scheduled to see. The receptionist, a young woman with auburn hair and tired eyes, looked up from her terminal, hesitating slightly before asking for identification. Simeon handed over his state ID, still slightly bent from the earlier incident. Her fingers trembled as she read the name. Before she could respond, Branton snatched the paper from her hand. He didn't even read it. He looked Simeon in the eye and said they'd already told him once. He wasn't allowed to loiter or harass staff. Simeon's eyebrows furrowed, his voice remaining steady as he explained, once again, that he was here for a scheduled appointment. This time, Kellis stepped in and accused him of forging the documents. He claimed it was suspicious that Simeon would have paper blueprints instead of digital renderings. He pointed at the worn folder like it was a weapon. Branton, growing louder, suggested he could call building security management and have him permanently banned. Other people in the lobby had begun to notice. A man in a tailored gray suit turned his head slightly and then quickly looked away, deciding it wasn't worth his attention. A woman with a coffee cup in hand whispered to her colleague, eyes flicking between Simeon and the guards. Simeon remained calm. He reiterated the name of his contact, the floor number, and the meeting topic. But Branton raised his voice again, now accusing him of creating a public disturbance. Simeon could feel it, a performance more than a warning. They were baiting him, daring him to react, to validate their assumptions. When he didn't rise to it, Branton escalated anyway. He ordered Simeon to step aside, reached for his arm without consent, and attempted to turn him toward the exit. Simeon gently pulled back, stating firmly that he was not causing trouble, that he had every right to be there, and asked to speak with someone from the legal office directly. Branton's eyes narrowed. He leaned in close and whispered something low, barely audible, his tone cruel and personal. Simeon's jaw locked, but he said nothing. Branton then radioed for additional backup. Within moments, a third security officer arrived, this one older, heavier, with a belt loaded with equipment and a blank expression. Without waiting for explanation, he flanked Simeon and asked him to place his hands behind his back for a search. Simeon didn't resist. He stood tall, held his folder tightly, and asked what justification they had for detaining a man with a scheduled meeting and identification. Branton replied sharply that refusing to leave when asked was grounds for removal, regardless of paperwork. The older officer reached for his radio, preparing to call the building supervisor, but Branton waved him off and gave the go-ahead to proceed. In front of the receptionist, in full view of half a dozen lobby witnesses, they instructed Simeon to step toward the side wall near the concierge desk. He obeyed, not out of agreement, but to avoid further escalation. They took his bag again, emptied it onto the counter, and examined every document as though searching for counterfeit currency or blueprints to a bomb. A blueprint fell to the floor and was stepped on by Kellis as he reached for another item. Simeon flinched but said nothing. The receptionist looked on, silent, her face pale. Finally, after finding nothing unlawful, Branton handed the items back and said that regardless of any meeting on file, they were denying him access today due to safety concerns. Simeon stood in silence, hands clenched at his sides, his folder now loosely reassembled and damaged. He turned without a word and exited through the same doors he had entered. Back outside, the warmth had risen. The streets were fuller now, the sounds of city life growing sharper. He walked slowly this time, moving past the plaza, past the rows of polished glass, until he found an alley adjacent to the side entrance. He leaned against the cool brick wall there, away from the front-facing facade, and exhaled slowly. His face, until now composed, finally sagged under the weight of what had just happened. The sense of helplessness was overwhelming, not because he had no right to be there, but because those rights meant nothing when no one enforced them for him. The sadness came not from what they did, but from how easily they did it, how confident they were in being able to twist perception until their cruelty looked like caution. He reached into the folder and retrieved one sheet, a preliminary ownership diagram with his signature already notarized, and stared at it long and hard. The next morning, before the sun had cleared the skyline, Simeon was back. He didn't wait outside this time. He walked directly into the Wilhest's underground parking deck, not through defiance, but through strategy. The upper-level security had already written him off, so now he would start from the building's roots, where no one expected resistance. He walked slowly past a row of janitorial carts and concrete support beams, his footsteps steady, his breath even. A maintenance worker, pushing a bin of towels, paused and glanced at him but said nothing. Simeon stopped near the service elevator, the one rarely used by clients or executives, and waited. After 5 minutes, an elevator door opened, revealing a short man in a red facilities uniform, clutching a clipboard. Simeon stepped forward and asked for directions to the maintenance office, saying he needed to confirm a scheduled systems review for the south stairwell, a lie with just enough polish to pass as routine. The man looked him over, frowned, but pointed down a long corridor. Simeon nodded his thanks and walked on. He wasn't going to the maintenance office. He was using the elevator as a corridor, a place to slip unseen past the higher levels of scrutiny. His heart pounded in quiet rhythm. His goal wasn't confrontation anymore, it was presence, a reclaiming of space, a statement, made not with volume, but with footsteps on forbidden floors. He reached the second level without challenge. From there, he took the stairwell to the mezzanine, a quiet hallway leading to the east lobby, adjacent to a small glass conference room used by low-level firms and regional sales teams. He found an empty chair just outside the room and sat, his briefcase tucked tightly under his leg. He didn't fidget. He didn't look around. He simply sat, still as stone, reading from a folded architectural digest he pulled from the inside of his coat. For 15 minutes, no one said a word. Employees passed. Some looked his way, confused, uncertain, but said nothing. That changed when a mid-level manager named Reese entered the hallway. Reese was the type who prided himself on knowing everyone's name 2 levels below him. He noticed Simeon immediately. He stopped, stared, then strode forward with clipped steps, wearing a forced smile. He greeted Simeon as if they'd met, using a tone meant to disarm. Simeon stood, politely explained that he was waiting for a rescheduled meeting, and mentioned a name, one he had overheard the day before, just enough to make it sound legitimate. Reese smiled tighter, then excused himself to make a call. Within minutes, Branton and Kellis appeared at the end of the hall. Simeon saw them before they saw him. He remained seated, his eyes returning to the page in front of him, the illusion of calm holding his body in check. When they reached him, Branton didn't speak at first. He simply stood in front of Simeon, casting a shadow across the open magazine. Kellis leaned over and pointed to the briefcase, instructing him to open it again. Simeon didn't move. He stared forward and said he had already been searched. Branton stepped in closer, this time grabbing the handle of the briefcase himself, trying to wrench it loose. Simeon held on, not violently, not aggressively, but firmly. Branton raised his voice and accused him of returning to cause trouble. Kellis added that he was now trespassing and could be arrested. A few employees passing by stopped to watch. No one intervened. Branton forced the briefcase open, scattering the contents once again across the polished tile. He picked up one of the blueprints, rolled it into a tube, and tapped it against his palm, mocking the technical jargon on the page. He asked if Simeon had drawn these himself or stolen them from someone who actually worked there. Kellis laughed and kicked one of the pages further down the hallway. Simeon's mouth opened slightly, but he said nothing. His eyes followed the page as it slid to a stop near a trash bin. Branton moved behind him, placing a firm hand on Simeon's shoulder, pushing him forward. He told him they were escorting him out through the loading dock. Simeon complied, retrieving what papers he could without making a sound. As he was led through the back corridors, he passed a group of delivery men and custodial staff. One of them recognized him from the previous day and looked away quickly, choosing not to acknowledge what he saw. The loading dock was exposed to the rear alley, where dumpsters lined the wall like forgotten tombstones. Branton shoved the briefcase into Simeon's chest and told him not to come back. Kellis added that if he was seen again, the police would be called and charges pressed. Simeon stood there, surrounded by refuse, wind tugging at the corners of his coat, his documents held tightly against his chest. When they turned and re-entered the building, the door locked behind them with a solid, final click. He looked down at himself, dust on his slacks, a smudge across his collar from Branton's grip, fingerprints dark against the leather of the briefcase. He walked away slowly, each step echoing in the alley like a drumbeat of shame. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. But inside, something had shifted. The weight of repeated humiliation had begun to compact, pressing into the corners of his mind, turning pressure into resolve. By the time he reached the main street again, the sun had risen fully. The city continued indifferent. People hurried past. No one saw him. Or rather, no one chose to. He stopped outside a coffee shop, stared into the window, and saw his reflection. He didn't need to see its name to know its shape. That building had become the symbol of every glance, every doubt, every grip that had tightened on his arm like a reminder that people like him weren't supposed to belong. And yet, he did belong. Not just in theory, not just on paper, but in actual, tangible legal fact. The documents in his bag proved it. The bank transfer confirmation, the design contracts, the zoning approvals, and the acquisition blueprint all bore his name. But the guards hadn't seen those things. Or they had, and they hadn't cared. That was the truth that stung the deepest. Proof didn't matter if people had already made up their minds. He spent the night reviewing every document in silence, not looking for errors, but reminding himself of what he had earned, what he had built, what he had already survived. He didn't sleep. The next morning, without changing his clothes, he folded his blueprints into protective sleeves, secured them inside a flat black portfolio, and returned to the tower once more, not through the service entrance, not across the street, but straight up the central steps, bold as brass, quiet as winter. The city moved around him like it always did, fast, impatient, self-involved. But Simeon had become immovable. His silence no longer signaled submission. It had become a mask for strategy. He entered through the same glass doors, felt the same blast of cold air, saw the same polished floors and brushed steel fixtures. But this time, his pace did not slow. He didn't look toward the security desk. He didn't search for Branton or Kellis. He moved like he had every right to be there, which, ironically, had always been the case. He reached the elevator bank before they noticed him. He heard the call behind him, firm and sharp, like a whip crack in an empty room. He paused, pivoted slowly, and met Branton's eyes. The guard was already approaching, expression dark and jaw set. Kellis emerged from behind the desk, already dialing someone on his earpiece. Simeon stood still as Branton approached, hands in view, posture calm. The hallway felt quiet as people moved to the side, some curious, most indifferent, none engaged. Branton demanded to know what Simeon thought he was doing, how he had gotten past the desk, why he kept returning. Simeon answered with a single sentence. He was attending a confirmed meeting, scheduled through the city redevelopment office. Branton scoffed and pointed to the portfolio. He asked what was inside, and when Simeon didn't hand it over, he reached for it. This time, Simeon didn't resist, but he didn't help either. He allowed Branton to pry open the zipper and pull out the protected documents. Branton examined them without understanding, frowning at the floor plans, the city seals, the official stamps of approval. He flipped through them until he reached a single sheet with the Wilhust name embossed in gold and Simeon's name listed under redevelopment principal. His eyes scanned the page, then stopped. A flicker of confusion passed over his features. He recovered quickly and barked at Kellis to call up to the main office. Simeon stood in silence while they verified his credentials. A full 5 minutes passed before the answer came down. Yes, Mr. Varelli had a standing appointment. Yes, he was expected. Yes, he had authority to be on site. The look on Branton's face shifted again, this time not toward embarrassment, but toward something colder, disbelief mixed with defensiveness. He handed back the portfolio with a grunt and told Simeon he could proceed, but warned him not to cause disruption. Simeon accepted the documents, zipped the case shut, and walked past them without a word. But his shoulders, once slightly bent, now squared. His back straightened, his steps lengthened. He didn't need their apology. What he needed was access, and now he had it. The elevator carried him to the 27th floor, where he was greeted by a junior administrator who escorted him to the planning office. The administrator didn't look him up and down, didn't question his presence. She offered him a glass of water and directed him to a waiting room with warm lighting and modern chairs. Simeon sat in silence, listening to the hum of ventilation and the low murmur of conversation behind frosted glass walls. Minutes later, a tall man in a pressed suit entered the room and extended his hand. He introduced himself as Nolan Cray, one of the senior architects overseeing the Wilhust Redevelopment Initiative. He thanked Simeon for his time and apologized for the delay. Simeon rose, shook the man's hand, and followed him into the boardroom. As the door closed behind them, the sounds of the city faded. Inside, the table was spread with maps, diagrams, digital tablets, and models in white resin. Cray gestured for Simeon to present his plan. Without missing a beat, Simeon opened his portfolio, laid out the revised blueprints, and began to speak. His voice was low, steady, deliberate. He explained the structural reinforcements needed to support the vertical garden initiative. He pointed out the outdated water lines that would need replacing. He proposed sustainable upgrades, tax-saving allocations, and civic beautification adjustments that would make the Wilhust a model of future urban integration. Cray listened closely, nodding often. At one point, another executive entered, glanced at the presentation, and mouthed the word impressive to Cray before sitting quietly. Simeon answered every question, referenced data without needing to check notes, and demonstrated a technical precision that left no room for doubt. He traced his hand across wrought iron railings, paused at intersections where public housing met new development, and made quiet notes in the worn notebook he carried in his coat pocket. His mind remained fixed on the Wilhelmus Tower. It was not just a structure anymore. It had become a symbol of everything he had endured. The weight of it wasn't in its steel or glass, but in the men who stood at its doors. Men who saw nothing but a profile, a posture, a shade of skin they'd already judged before a word had been spoken. Though he had been allowed into the boardroom, he had not been invited. He had earned his seat, demanded it with paperwork and patience, but still, the guards had made sure to frame his presence as an exception, not a right. That frame had to be broken. 2 days later, he returned, not as a client, not as a guest, but as a man testing boundaries. He wore the same coat, carried the same black portfolio, but this time, he arrived 10 minutes earlier than his scheduled follow-up meeting. He did not approach the guards. He walked past them directly to the elevators. As he stepped in, he caught a flicker of movement. Kellis rising behind the desk, speaking urgently into a shoulder mic. Simeon pressed the button for the 27th floor and waited. When the doors opened, he stepped out into the hallway, just as 3 building staff members rounded the corner. They were mid-conversation, not expecting anyone, and they paused when they saw him. Simeon nodded politely and moved past them. He reached the glass-walled meeting room where he had first waited and stood outside it, examining the artwork on the wall with measured interest. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, the elevator dinged again. This time, Branton stepped out. His posture was tighter than usual, his face controlled but tense. He spotted Simeon instantly. The hallway was quiet, the energy brittle. Branton didn't yell. He didn't accuse. He walked forward slowly and said, in a tone meant to sound reasonable, that Mr. Varelli had not yet been cleared for early arrival, and that building protocol required waiting in the lobby until the scheduled time. Simeon responded by gesturing to his confirmation email, clearly time-stamped, clearly indicating flexibility within the meeting window. Branton glanced at it, barely scanned it, and replied that unauthorized movement through tenant floors was still a violation. Simeon asked calmly what specific clause had been breached. Branton's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Instead, he took out his radio and signaled for a supervisor. Moments later, a woman in a gray blazer appeared. She was the building operations manager, and she approached the scene with the kind of professional stiffness that often accompanies political damage control. She asked Simeon to explain his presence, and he did, clearly, logically, without emotion. She reviewed the confirmation email, glanced at the documents he carried, and then turned to Branton. Her tone was sharp but quiet as she reminded him that Simeon's access had already been cleared and that any interference would be logged and reviewed. Branton nodded, but his expression didn't change. The manager offered Simeon an apology, not personal, not warm, but procedural, and escorted him to a nearby lounge while his meeting room was prepared. As they walked, Simeon didn't look back, but he felt the glare burning into his shoulders. Branton had not been embarrassed. He had been challenged, and that, Simeon understood, would not be forgotten. The meeting itself was short, routine, a progress check on the redevelopment proposal, which had now moved into early approval with minor adjustments. The city liaison praised Simeon's insight, noting how few developers understood the historical value of mixed zoning structures. They offered compliments on his concept to preserve the exterior moldings while reinforcing internal frameworks. Simeon accepted the feedback politely, made a few additional notes, and said little else. When the meeting ended, he didn't return to the elevator. He walked instead toward the stairwell, not because he had anything to prove, but because the hallway overlooked the lobby, and he wanted to see them again, not to gloat, but to remember. From the glass landing, he spotted Branton standing stiffly at the security desk. Kellis sat beside him, eyes scanning the entrance like a watchdog. Simeon knew what they were doing. They weren't just watching him, they were trying to catch him in something they could report, something they could escalate. He left the stairwell and exited through a side corridor without passing them. Outside, the sun had dipped just below the buildings, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. He walked for blocks without speaking, his breath slow, his pace controlled. He stopped only once, outside an old post office that had been converted into a community hall. The bricks reminded him of his grandfather's workshop, and for a moment, he leaned against the wall, letting the memory pass through him. It crept into foundations, like roots pushing against concrete, waiting to buckle the surface in time. Now, that quiet power had to be directed. The Wilhus Tower was no longer just an investment or a project. It was a fault line beneath years of insult, proof that the illusion of control so often wielded by gatekeepers like Branton and Kellis could be challenged, not with force, but with permanence. Simeon spent the morning finalizing the acquisition paperwork for a connected parcel of land behind the Wilhus property, an alley previously used for deliveries, barely noted in the original architectural deeds. He had purchased it through a shell subsidiary 6 months earlier, anticipating that his eventual ownership of the building itself would create complications in access points. Now, that forgotten strip of land would become the wedge. He would propose a redevelopment entrance through the alley, shifting pedestrian access and requiring a security restructuring that would either displace or demote the men who had made it their mission to erase him. But that was only the beginning. That same afternoon, he arrived at the tower for his final design submission meeting. This time, he wore a tailored charcoal gray jacket, crisp shirt, and dark slacks, not because he needed to prove his worth through fashion, but because armor came in many forms, and today he needed every layer. As he entered the lobby, he saw them again. Branton was at the desk, Kellis by the elevator bank. They saw him too. Their eyes followed his every movement, but no words were exchanged. The building operations manager had logged the incident from earlier in the week. The guards had been instructed to allow him through without obstruction. Still, the air between them was lead-heavy. Simeon didn't glance at them. He walked to the elevator, stepped in, and pressed the button for the 28th floor, the development boardroom, higher than his last meetings, symbolically and literally closer to oversight. When he entered the room, he found the table already lined with executives, urban planners, and legal advisors. City officials joined by video conference. All eyes turned as he unpacked his plans. He presented with authority, precision, and clarity. He outlined a new pedestrian corridor, accessible from both front and rear of the building, funneling community foot traffic into what had once been an exclusive corporate lobby. He demonstrated how rerouting access would qualify the building for a civic engagement tax grant, while also triggering the necessity for restructuring security placement to accommodate new movement patterns. As he spoke, he noted subtle glances between the senior planners. One whispered to another, a third scribbled notes. They weren't reacting to the brilliance of his design. They were realizing that his influence extended beyond aesthetics. This man wasn't just building something. He was changing who controlled its gates. One of the city liaisons asked a pointed question about existing security infrastructure. Simeon responded with specific references to past complaints from visitors regarding entrance accessibility, drawn from logged records he had obtained under the city's public data statute. He then detailed how the new layout would resolve those issues while also reducing liability risk. By the time he finished, no one challenged the viability of his plan. It was too well structured, too deeply researched, too undeniably sound. The meeting adjourned with formal congratulations, and as he packed his materials, one of the legal advisors handed him a signed acknowledgement, a document confirming approval for immediate Stage 1 implementation. Simeon thanked them, tucked the paper into his folder, and left the room. He took the stairs this time, walking down floor by floor, breathing in the still air between levels like a man descending through layers of history. When he reached the ground floor, he didn't head for the main lobby. Instead, he walked the interior hallway to the employee entrance that led into the rear service corridor. He paused there for a moment, then entered. The hallway was dimmer, lined with concrete walls and faint chemical smells. He passed a janitor wheeling a mop cart, nodded politely, and kept walking. As he reached the junction where service staff clocked in and security teams took breaks, he found Branton and Kellis standing just beyond a glass panel divider. They were laughing at something on a phone, unaware of his approach. When they noticed him, their posture changed not with guilt, but with something else, irritation, maybe, or a bitterness born of confusion. Why was he there again? Why did he keep coming back? Branton straightened, ready to say something, but Simeon beat him to it. He said nothing cruel, nothing vulgar, nothing even harsh. He simply explained that he had just come from the final board review and that his redesigns, including those impacting access flow and security post assignments, had been approved. He said it like a man delivering news, not vengeance. He waited a beat, then turned to leave, offering no further words. Behind him, the silence was thick. No sarcasm, no taunts, no dismissals, just the heavy weight of acknowledgement, sharp and cutting in its quietness. Simeon exited the building through the rear loading zone, stepped into the alley he now owned, and looked up at the building that had once symbolized everything that stood between him and recognition. Now, that same building had begun to shift under his influence, not because he had demanded it, but because he had designed it that way. The next morning, construction notices were posted near the rear access doors. A memo circulated among Wilhus staff detailing the temporary closure of certain security checkpoints and the reassignment of coverage schedules. No names were mentioned, but Branton and Kellis were among those reassigned to off-site duties. Most of them didn't know the history. They only knew that Mr. Varelli had clearance, that his name carried a flag in the system, that he was expected on the upper floors, and his meetings were not to be delayed or questioned. To them, he was just another executive with a schedule and a reason. But for Simeon, walking into the building was no longer about gaining access. It was about ownership, not just in legal terms or technical influence, but in the reclamation of something deeper, the restoration of dignity that had been stripped piece by piece through humiliation, delay, and unchecked prejudice. The rear access point, once ignored, now stood under new lighting with temporary signage directing staff and construction crews through the revised corridor Simeon had designed. Inside the planning offices, his final blueprint had been accepted and approved. The structural teams were already preparing for Phase 1 implementation. Yet despite all progress, Simeon had spoken little of what had happened to him during those early days of rejection. He had never sent a complaint, never demanded apology, never raised his voice to the men who had tried to erase his presence. He had simply endured, responded, documented, and outmaneuvered. But silence, even when tactical, builds pressure, and pressure always seeks release. That release came unexpectedly during the Wilhus Redevelopment Stakeholder Symposium, a formal gathering of financial leaders, city planners, corporate partners, and development executives organized to showcase the direction of the tower's transformation and the impact of mixed-use civic models across the city. Simeon had been invited to speak not as a client or external contractor, but as a principal architect and investment partner. His name appeared third on the printed itinerary, positioned just before a city council member and after a representative from the Urban Renewal Board. He arrived 10 minutes early, not out of caution, but custom, wearing a navy suit, matte silver cufflinks, and the quiet poise of a man who no longer walked into rooms hoping to be welcomed. The symposium was held in the tower's largest conference gallery, a wide glass atrium with tiered seating and digital projection walls. As attendees filled rows, staff members passed out information packets. Inside them, beneath the speaker bios, was a short profile titled Key Development Contributors. Simeon's name appeared twice, once under Architectural Design Lead and again under Ownership Consortium, Varelli Equity Partners. It was the first time most people in the room realized he wasn't just a designer. He was one of the building's partial owners. The discovery moved quietly through the audience, a wave of nods, raised brows, and whispered side comments. But it wasn't until the panel moderator introduced him that the truth began to carry weight. The moderator, reading from the teleprompter, welcomed Simeon to the stage with a brief overview, his degrees, his design accolades, his published works. Then came the closing line, spoken clearly through the microphone and carried across the chamber. And as one of the principal acquisition partners behind the Wilhus redevelopment, Mr. Varelli brings not just vision, but ownership to this project's foundation. The room stilled. Some leaned forward. Others froze mid-sip. A few executives at the far end turned to one another, expressions unreadable. Simeon stepped to the podium, adjusted the mic slightly, and began to speak. His voice was steady, his tone restrained, but his words were deliberate. He spoke of sustainable structures, civic access, environmental balance. He referenced building codes, public use strategies, and community value per square foot. But halfway through his talk, something shifted. He paused for a breath, then set down the clicker, controlling his slides. He looked at the audience, hands at his sides, and let the silence thicken. Then he began again, this time without the corporate rhythm. He spoke of what it meant to be mistaken for a trespasser in a space you help finance. He explained how design is not just about structures, but assumptions, about who buildings are built for and who they exclude. He described in calm, clinical language how he had been stopped at the door, turned away 3 times, searched, humiliated, and labeled a threat for no reason other than his presence. He didn't name the guards. He didn't raise his voice. But every word struck like an iron beam dropped onto concrete. People shifted in their seats. A woman in the front row lowered her eyes. A man near the back ran a hand across his mouth as if to erase a thought. Simeon continued. He said this building would no longer be a space that rewarded assumption. It would not tolerate judgment born of prejudice masked as protocol. It would be restructured from the inside to reflect the diversity of the city that surrounded it. Not through slogans, not through PR, but through policy, access, equity, and visibility. He closed his remarks with a quiet statement that ownership is not only about financial stake, but about the right to stand in the space you've helped build without being asked to prove you belong there. When he stepped back from the podium, the applause came slowly at first, then swelled, not loud or explosive, but respectful, firm, unignorable. He nodded once to the moderator, gathered his folder, and returned to his seat. Behind him, whispers began, not gossip, but reckoning. By the time the symposium ended, his name was no longer just on the schedule. It was on their minds. That evening, as the event dispersed, Simeon walked out through the main lobby. He passed the new security officers, who nodded to him with practiced neutrality. The story had spread, not through tabloids or headlines, but through proximity. Those who attended the event had spoken of it to colleagues, and those colleagues had passed it on. It was not gossip, it was revelation. The image of the quiet man who had once sat on the steps, folder in hand, now coexisted with the man who had stood at the podium and spoken of ownership, access, and dignity with the precision of a surgeon and the gravity of lived experience. But the change Simeon noticed most came not from strangers, but from the structure itself. The building, once hostile in its silence, had begun to feel navigable, not just physically, but emotionally. He no longer braced himself before each interaction. He no longer felt the need to rehearse his words before speaking to receptionists or assistants or managers. The coldness that had once gripped him like a second skin began to loosen. And yet, with that loosening came an unexpected weight. Recognition, while overdue, brought with it exposure. He had never wanted to be a symbol. He had wanted only to build, to create spaces where others could belong without fear or explanation. But now his name had become shorthand for something larger, a representation of justice forced into visibility. And that kind of weight was not easily shrugged off. 3 days after the symposium, he received a formal invitation to a follow-up roundtable with the City Redevelopment Board. The meeting, scheduled in a private lounge on the 40th floor of the Wilhus Tower, would include policy advocates, community liaisons, legal advisors, and several stakeholders from surrounding projects. The topic: urban equity in institutional spaces. The subtext: a deeper inquiry into what Simeon had exposed without accusation. When he arrived that morning, dressed in black slacks and a slate blue shirt, the elevator doors opened to a level he had never seen before. Vaulted ceilings, glass walls, a panoramic view of the city's east side stretching out like a map of possibility. He stepped into the lounge and was greeted not by suspicion, but by a handshake from the city chairperson herself. They spoke briefly, exchanging measured pleasantries before the room filled. As the meeting began, the conversation moved swiftly from general development strategies to specific practices of access control, personnel accountability, and community integration. Midway through, a city legal advisor asked if Simeon would be willing to share more detail about his early encounters in the building. He hesitated, not because he feared the questions, but because the answers were too complex for bullet points. Still, he spoke. He told them of the first day of standing on the steps and being accused without cause. He described the way his documents had been scattered across the sidewalk, the dismissive laughter, the pressure of a boot nudging his coat. He described the second visit, the public search, the loaded stairs, the confiscation of his materials in front of passive onlookers. He described being escorted to the alley, the smell of rot and exhaust, the sting of humiliation pressed into his palms like heat. And he did it without raising his voice, without dramatizing the details. He spoke like an architect, methodical, unflinching, with precise memory and no embellishment. When he finished, the room sat in silence, not out of disbelief, but because the truth, when laid bare, without rage or apology, left no room for distraction. The city chairperson leaned forward, resting her chin on folded hands, and asked what he thought should happen next. Simeon answered without hesitation. He said that policies were meaningless without enforcement, that access was a right, not a courtesy, and that prejudice disguised as protocol had no place in a public-facing institution. He recommended mandatory review boards for front-facing staff, anonymous reporting systems, and legal accountability clauses tied to corporate tenancy agreements. No one interrupted him. No one argued. A motion was proposed and documented for follow-up in the next city session. As the meeting closed, several attendees approached him quietly, offering thanks, not just for his ideas, but for his presence, for the grace with which he had dismantled the lie of neutrality. Later that evening, back in his apartment, Simeon opened the windows and let the wind carry through the rooms. He sat at his desk and opened the notebook again, turning past the pages he had filled with incidents and facts and names. He reached a blank page and began writing something different, not a report, not a plan, but a letter. A letter to the next young builder who might stand on those same steps, portfolio in hand, invisible to the world around him. He wrote about how to keep breathing when the weight of being unseen feels crushing. He wrote about how power, real power, does not come from noise, but from structure, from design, from the ability to hold your line even when no one sees it. He ended the letter with a single line: "If they don't see you, build something so permanent they cannot look away." The next morning, he delivered copies of the roundtable proposals to the office of the building's ownership consortium. He walked the halls not as a guest, not as an exception, but as one of them. Employees greeted him by name. The security officers nodded. The receptionist smiled. And for the first time since he first approached the tower, he felt no trace of the old tension. The operations board held a closed-door session, one that included representatives from human resources, legal, and the third-party security contractor employed to staff the tower's ground-level entrances. It was during this session that the names Branton and Kellis emerged repeatedly, not just as enforcers of flawed judgment, but as emblematic failures of protocol, training, and ethical discretion. The board reviewed footage, testimonies, and Simeon's formal design and ownership documentation. They read in uncomfortable detail the entries from his notebook, submitted with the policy reform proposals during the Roundtable Initiative. Though Simeon had never called for specific punitive action, his written accounts had drawn an irrefutable map of their behavior. It was not only a record of exclusion, it was an indictment, laid bare without insult or embellishment. A few days later, both Branton and Kellis were summoned to an unannounced meeting on the mezzanine level. They arrived expecting a shift rotation briefing. Instead, they found themselves seated across from three members of the internal review panel. Neither of them spoke much during the 30-minute meeting. They answered questions, confirmed timelines, offered guarded responses about the events in question. They insisted there had been no ill intent, that their actions had been guided by standard procedure, that they had only been doing their jobs. The panelists listened but did not interrupt. When the questions ended, the room fell silent. Then, without ceremony, they were informed that their contracts were under review pending further investigation. They were placed on indefinite suspension with restricted building access. Their badges were deactivated by the end of the day. Word spread quickly among staff. At first, it traveled in hushed conversations at water coolers and beneath the glow of cafeteria lights. Some expressed surprise, others nodded knowingly. A few who had previously remained silent about uncomfortable interactions with the two men now spoke openly. A junior analyst in finance described being followed through the lobby after hours. A delivery contractor mentioned repeated interrogations about his ID despite wearing a verified badge. A part-time concierge whispered about her resignation 3 months earlier, prompted by repeated dismissals of her complaints. Each account added weight to the board's decision. It was no longer about a single incident. It was a culture, and that culture was now under reconstruction. Meanwhile, Simeon continued his work. He was not involved in the disciplinary proceedings. He neither requested updates nor asked for outcomes. His focus remained fixed on the structural and communal elements of the Wacth redevelopment. He met weekly with construction leads, checked design progress on the new community access corridor, and drafted revisions for an adjacent rooftop garden space designed to welcome tenants and neighborhood residents alike. But even as he worked, the air around him began to shift again. Several building executives approached him privately in the days that followed. Some offered acknowledgments, not apologies, not rehearsed corporate phrases, but measured admissions of things they had once chosen not to see. One told him that watching his symposium speech had forced a personal reckoning. Another simply said that the lobby felt different now, and that it should have felt this way all along. The most unexpected moment came late on a Thursday afternoon when a letter arrived at Simeon's office. It bore no sender's name, only a return address from a quiet suburb miles outside the city. Inside, the letter was short. The handwriting was careful, not practiced, but honest. It was from Branton. In a few concise paragraphs, he described his confusion, his discomfort, and his slow realization that what he thought had been vigilance was, in fact, prejudice made routine. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't attempt to defend his actions. He simply wrote that he had watched the symposium speech in full, twice, and that it had undone something inside him he hadn't known needed undoing. Simeon read the letter once, then again, then folded it and placed it in the back of the notebook he no longer needed to carry daily. He did not respond. There was no need. Change, if it was real, didn't need acknowledgement to be meaningful. A few weeks later, news quietly spread that Kellis had taken a job out of state, somewhere rural, away from the high-rise world he had once policed like a gatekeeper. Branton, according to one of the newer guards, had begun volunteering with a local youth mentorship group, teaching basic fitness and discipline. Whether it was guilt or growth, Simeon would never know. But the building had changed. And perhaps, in their own ways, they had too. The true consequence was not in their removal. It was in the awareness that followed. The Wacth Tower began implementing mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all contracted security teams. The operations board revised their access protocol language. Community advocates were consulted for the first time in the tower's policy formation meetings. None of it erased what had happened, but it ensured that what happened would not be buried beneath silence. The city issued a statement weeks later, citing the Wacth redevelopment as a model for public-private collaboration in equitable urban space reform. Simeon's name appeared in the closing paragraph, not as a footnote, but as a contributor to citywide policy evolution. Still, through all of this, he remained grounded. Spring emerged slowly over the city, sunlight slanting longer across building faces that had once seemed untouched by warmth, and Wacth Tower, once a fortress of unspoken exclusion, now stood as a symbol not only of architectural refinement, but of something deeper, possibility reshaped by truth. For weeks after the restructuring, after the security reforms and the procedural amendments and the quiet exits of those who once wielded power with contempt, the building moved through its days with a new rhythm, one not born of efficiency alone, but of awareness. It was not dramatic. There were no grand ceremonies, no marble plaques commemorating what had changed. The transformation was more honest than that. It showed itself in the way people paused before interrupting, in the way voices softened when answering questions, in the subtle precision of listening that had not existed before Simeon Varelli's voice entered the building, not with thunder, but with fact. Simeon kept coming, not because he had anything left to prove, but because the work was not finished. Change never stayed changed unless you remained part of it. He met with community leaders in the renovated conference wing, walked new tenants through design concepts, and partnered with local schools for after-hours architecture sessions for students from underserved neighborhoods. His presence was no longer questioned, no longer policed, but it had also never become performative. He never demanded to be seen. He simply never allowed himself to be overlooked. One Wednesday afternoon, as he stood near the East Terrace overlooking the expansion site, he was joined by Devin Hale, the director of the Urban Equity Council, who had watched the Wilhust redevelopment with growing admiration. Devin was younger, fast-spoken, thoughtful, and had made a career out of transforming theoretical policy into lived infrastructure. Together they walked the perimeter of the terrace, talking not about buildings or budgets, but about permanence. Devin asked Simeon if he had imagined the ending would look like this. Simeon didn't answer right away. He looked out at the city instead. The hum of buses, the rhythm of foot traffic, the life pulsing through a place that had once felt indifferent. Then he said that he had never been interested in endings, only in places that hold. Devin smiled and said that sometimes holding is the hardest part. They walked the rest of the terrace in silence. In the weeks that followed, a public article appeared in a regional journal titled Designing Dignity, the Wilhust Case Study. It was not authored by Simeon, nor did it feature his photograph, but his name was mentioned in every section. The article didn't dramatize what had happened. It outlined the process, the architectural proposals, the access restructuring, the cultural shifts prompted not by slogans, but by decisions. It concluded with a quote attributed to Simeon, one he had given during a smaller planning session a month earlier. "We don't need buildings that stand. We need buildings that know why they're standing." That quote echoed across city planning forums for weeks. It became a reference point for new projects, a reminder that design must reflect not just need, but values. Back inside the Wilhust Tower, a new guard took his post at the main lobby. He was older than Branton, softer in presence, and carried himself not with authority, but with attentiveness. His first interaction with Simeon was brief, a greeting, eye contact, and a simple welcome that carried no weight beyond civility. Simeon returned it with a nod and moved on, carrying plans for the new community auditorium to the planning team on the 25th floor. That space had not been in the original design, but he had added it quietly, funded it personally, and ensured its purpose would reflect the message that had shaped everything else. That space, like people, must be given room to speak. That auditorium opened 3 months later. The ribbon cutting was informal, attended by community leaders, city officials, and students from the neighborhood who had contributed their ideas in a design lab led by Simeon's team. Inside, the walls bore quotes not from politicians or investors, but from anonymous voices gathered through public submissions. One quote, painted above the stage, read, "I never thought I'd belong in a place like this until I saw someone who looked like me build it." No name was attached to it. It didn't need one. That same week, Simeon received an email from a young architect based in Atlanta. She had read about his work and wanted guidance, not just on projects, but on how to navigate the spaces that would always expect her to prove herself twice for being both brilliant and black. Simeon wrote her back that night. His email was not long, but it was specific. He told her that silence could be a weapon or a wound depending on how you hold it. He told her that proof, while exhausting, is sometimes the only language systems understand, but that it must always be wielded with purpose, not bitterness. He told her that the work is slow, but it lasts. He closed by saying that architecture is not only the shaping of structures, it's the shaping of memory, and that when you build with intention, people walk through the door not just differently, but permanently changed. She responded the next morning with thanks and a promise to build something that would make people look twice for all the right reasons. Simeon saved her email under a folder labeled Next. As seasons turned, the Wilhust Tower settled into its new identity. No longer a monument of exclusion, it became an evolving space, fluid, imperfect, but responsive. The people who moved through it every day carried no knowledge of what it had once resisted, only of what it now offered. But Simeon never forgot. Not the steps, not the guards, not the alley, not the sting of being unseen. He carried those memories not as weight, but as blueprint. Not all justice arrives in gavel strikes or courtroom verdicts. Some of it arrives in quiet shifts, in policies rewritten, in protocols amended, in hearts disarmed not by argument, but by evidence. Simeon never sought revenge. What he built instead was presence made permanent. What he demanded was not recognition, but room to exist, to build, to own, and to open doors wider than he found them. The Wilhis Tower would never again be what it was. And that, in the end, was the real victory. Not that he walked through the doors, but that now others would not have to fight to follow. The end. If you enjoyed the story and want to see more narratives like this, filled with tension, transformation, and meaningful resolution, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support helps bring more powerful stories to life. What did you think of the plot? Which moment hit you the hardest? And where are you watching or reading from? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts and connect with readers from around the world.